Welcome everyone. This is our first of a series of FATF related webinars, which are both for the public and the private sector. As many of you will know, there's been a recently issued consultation on the revised guidance on a risk-based approach to VAs and VASPs. This would bring about important changes to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. So as part of this presentation, we will be delving ever deeper into the guidance and the related requirements. A couple of housekeeping matters before we start. We are aiming to keep this session to an hour. We've got a lot to cover. So if you have any questions, please post them on the chat and we will try and answer them at the end. We will aim to have a short questions and answer session within the hour, if possible, but otherwise we will be sticking around for another 50-20 minutes at least after the presentation. So if anyone wants to stay a bit longer, we're happy to have a chat with anyone, answer any questions that we may not be able to answer within the session. So let me thank you all for attending this webinar. Some of you may have seen the 2-page summary that we issued a few days ago. But if you want to have sight of that summary and any other documents, any other explainers that we will be working on over the coming weeks and months, you will be able to subscribe, details of which you will be able to see at the end in one of the slides. We will share that with you. So as I mentioned, last Friday, there was a launch of a public consultation in relation to the risk-based approach to virtual asset service providers. The guidance has been significantly changed, updated. As all of you probably know, the guidance is directed at countries, regulators, and also the private entities, the VASPs. So there's a lot to consider. The guidance, what it does, it aims to clarify a lot of the issues, focusing particularly on certain areas such as stable coins, DeFi, peer-to-peer payments, unhosted wallets, and also the travel rule and what is expected of VASPs in relation to the travel rule. So as part of this session, we'll be talking about some of these areas, highlighting some of the key issues and providing some of our insights, both from a technical perspective and also in relation to business processes. So the guidance was launched, as I said before, last Friday, and there's a very short window for responses. It closes on the 20th of April. So we would encourage everyone to engage as much as possible and provide feedback to this consultation. The intention is for this to be adopted at the June plenary meeting of FATF. So we do not expect a lot of changes to the current form of guidance, but we still obviously encourage people to respond and engage. So who we are XReg Consulting. We're a small boutique policy and regulatory consultancy firm specializing in crypto assets. We're a team of 13 and growing. We're based in London, Gibraltar, and Latin America. We're all former regulators, or most of us at least are former regulators with experience in policy making and also practical experience in regulatory compliance and strategic advice. We help governments, other public bodies, regulators, help them develop and make the sound policy.
Hold on.
So we work with regulators and train them and help them in terms of supervision and how they could effectively supervise this sector. We work with other public authorities, help them build capacity and provide them training. And we also help crypto asset firms understand and how they can meet regulatory requirements. As part of our support to governments and regulators, we also assist in the development and implementation of legal and regulatory frameworks. So who are your presenters? We've got Siân Jones, who I suspect many of you know. She's a senior partner at XReg with extensive background and experience in regulation, policy development, and virtual assets. She was a delegate and a technical expert on FATF's policy development group, and she sat on the inaugural virtual asset contact group before leaving the public service. Nathan, he's another partner at XReg. He's a qualified accountant with audit experience, including auditing crypto firms. He's a former technical expert at the Gibraltar Financial Services Commission in the DLT team, and he's XReg's internal audit, compliance, training lead with particular expertise on DeFi. Anna James is one of our policy consultants and our international relations manager. She's a former regulator with experience in authorizing firms, but also a lot of experience in international and government affairs. I'm Ernest Lima, and I'm also a partner at XReg. I'm the legal and policy lead at the firm. I'm a qualified lawyer with a lot of experience in financial services regulation, and I'm also the former head of policy at the Gibraltar Financial Services Commission. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anna.
Thank you, Ernest, and hello, everyone. As many of you will know, the Financial Action Task Force is the global standard setting body for standards on anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, and more recently, countering the financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Most countries in the world are members of either the Financial Action Task Force or FATF style regional bodies, and they must implement the standards that the FATF adopts, and entities in their jurisdictions must also implement the standards and comply with their obligations. The FATF has been looking at virtual assets for quite some time now. The first report it issued on virtual currencies was back in 2014, which it had updated a year later in 2015. But it didn't really formally bring virtual assets and virtual asset service providers within the scope of its standards until October 2018, when it clarified that its recommendations applied to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. It did this by updating one of its recommendations, recommendation 15, which applies to new technologies, and also by adding to its glossary both the virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. In June 2019, it published the first draft of the guidance that is now out for consultation, which was aimed at helping countries and industry, so obliged entities that could be either financial institutions or VASPs or other designated non-financial businesses or professions such as gaming companies, to implement the standards and comply with them. At the same time, in June 2019, it published interpretive notes to its recommendations 15 and 16, also to provide further guidance on how to implement the standards. Between June 2019 and June 2020, the FATF carried out an assessment of the level of implementation of its standards as they apply to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. And the findings of this assessment were published a year later in June 2020. The findings of the report included that, well, the FATF found that countries and industry were making progress in implementing the standards, but further work needed to be done, and also further guidance was required by countries and industry. At the same time, in June 2020, the FATF published a report to the G20 on stablecoins. Then in October 2020, to continue assisting countries in their implementation of these standards, as well as industry, it published virtual asset red flag indicators to assist with the risk assessments in this area, which brings us to March 2021. As Ernest just mentioned, last Friday, the FATF published its proposed revisions to this guidance, which is open for consultation until the 20th of April. And then the FATF hopes to adopt this at its plenary in June 2021 this year, when it will also publish the findings of its second 12-month review of the implementation of its standards. I'm handing back over to Siân, who will tell you a little bit more about the detail.
Well, hello everyone, and nice to see so many familiar names in our remote audience. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I think it's important to kick off by explaining that this updated guidance includes some new provisions, some changes to existing standards, and also a lot more detail, a lot more clarity on a fair few of the existing details. So what was in the current version, the 2019 version, over 50 pages. Well, in the consultation draft, it's nearly 100 pages. It'll probably end up being published when all the deletion bits are taken out, at least 50% bigger than the present one. So there's a lot in it, and there's a lot of clarity in it, but there's a lot of nuance in it. And probably you'll be relieved to hear that the definitions, which you see on the screen, that were established back in 2018 for virtual assets, what they are, and virtual asset service providers, what they are, actually those are left intact. They're in the recommendations themselves. That's the actual standards, and nothing's changed. But what's changed is really the perspective that needs to be taken, or at least it's clarified what that perspective should be. And you can read in a number of places throughout the revision references that in effect say that all assets are either financial assets or virtual assets. There's no gap between the two. There's no third way, if you like, between the classification of assets. They're either going to be traditional financial assets, which I have to say is, I don't think a defined term, but they're either that and covered in ways that are fully established, or they're financial assets, and therefore they're part of this 2018 expansion recommendations to include VAs and VASPs. What is very clearly set out in a number of places is that the definitions are to be interpreted broadly or expansively. In other words, that when countries look at these definitions, they should do so on the basis that everything is in rather than only certain things are in. There is that it is not to countries are not to view this as some kind of perimeter-based definition, which is what you tend to have in financial regulation about prudential and conduct matters, but rather from an AML perspective, consider it in. And it's quite clear that FATF and its members don't believe that very many things will fall or can fall outside of these two definitions. The next slide, please. So in scope, and bear in mind from the previous definition of virtual assets, you've got something which has to be read expansively. So you can interpret this as anyone acting as a business on behalf of customers, and even on behalf of customers is now looked at or to be interpreted very broadly, or who facilitates virtual asset related activities. So very clearly stated is, as expected, that all stable coins and all stablecoin governance bodies are in. Most virtual asset issuers are in, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But what is, who might be caught by that is also now very broadly interpreted. Many peer-to-peer platforms are in, and some matching and finding services that bring buyers and sellers together might be in certain circumstances, but where there is no transactional involvement, they are still out of scope. So there's a lot of detail, but you read these definitions on the presumption that it's in, unless you can find a hook from what is defined as not being in order to consider yourself outside of scope. Certainly developers have something to consider now, because developers that deploy software or have some involvement in deploying software or apps or smart contracts are pretty much, in most cases, in scope. And you could probably look at it this way, that anyone who receives a fee or commission spread or any other benefit from those VASP services or automation that performs those services, and that includes, by the way, any gains or other advantage that are made directly or indirectly, either now or in the future, bring folks into scope of being a VASP. It's no longer good enough to say, well, I'm just a developer and I've put code out there. If you're solely a developer and you have no other involvement and you have no possible way of gaining from it, you might well be out of scope. But if you are in some way rewarded, say by retaining some of the tokens, even though the gains that you might accrue from those holding those tokens can only be realized in the future, then you're almost certainly now a VASP. This is quite a big change in the way things are interpreted. Yeah, please carry on. So looking very quickly at what's out of scope, well, we already knew that central bank digital currencies fall outside scope, but nothing much has changed there, except there is a clarification here that central bank digital currencies are still within scope of FATF's recommendations, but viewed at from the perspective of being a form of fiat currency and not from the perspective of being virtual assets. So that is now made abundantly clear. If you're somehow an internet or cloud service provider, you're just providing those kind of technical capabilities, then you're out of scope. If you're a miner or a validator, and that is all you do. So if you've deployed some code and you say, well, now I've deployed code, I'm going to make some money from this stuff that I've deployed by being a validator on my own, the network that I've created, sorry, you're a VASP. If you are a miner or validator, and that is literally the sole function you perform, then you're out of scope. And the same sort of thing applies if you are a hardware wallet manufacturer or an unhosted wallet software provider. And again, those are the only things you do, then you're out of scope. If you're a website operator that enables buyers and sellers to identify one another and communicate with one another, you're out of scope. But if you have any kind of involvement in the transaction that's going on, you're clearly in scope. Peer-to-peer transactions between unhosted wallets, whether user-to-user transactions as we'd understand them, and they don't in any way touch a hosted wallet, then those are clearly stated as being outside scope. And of course, if you're a merchant accepting virtual assets in payment for goods or services, or you're a user, you're a consumer, and you're effectively paying for stuff for goods or services, then you're also out of scope. Next slide, please. VASPs have now to consider, and remember, consider VASPs are probably a broader group of people than we thought a week ago. VASPs need to consider that that being a VASP comes with a lot of compliance obligations, one of which is to undertake customer due diligence, understand who your customer is at the time that you onboard them. That's at the point where you begin to have a relationship with them. And I guess for most people, that will mean the moment that a customer signs up to an app, signs up through your website, signs up with you, onboards in any way, shape or form. You have to know who they are, and you have to undertake some due diligence on them. And that due diligence isn't a one-time hit, that is ongoing. Things like knowing the customer's identity, understanding if there's a beneficial owner. In other words, if your customer is effectively themselves acting for someone else or fronting for someone else, or there's someone else behind them who's actually the beneficial owner of the relationship, then you need to know about that person. You have to understand the purpose and the intended nature of the transactions that the customer is undertaking, and you have to scrutinize those transactions. Essentially, you've got to assign risk profiles to customers and indeed to types of transactions. And you also need to determine the level of ongoing monitoring that you need to apply. So those can have factors like, how large is the transaction, how frequent are the transactions, where's the customer based, are they using an unhosted wallet in their interactions with you to say fund your wallet, and so on and so forth. These are all factors that you have to consider, and you have to consider effectively in a deterministic way, but not necessarily in a formulaic way. So in other words, you have to apply a risk-based approach, which means, just as folks who are VASPs struggle sometimes to get bank accounts because of what is known as wholesale de-risking by banks and other financial institutions of anyone that's got anything to do with crypto. Similarly, you can't apply wholesale de-risking just because of a fact. You have to look at the individual risks associated with the client and also with the transaction. Next slide, please. VASPs will also, and this is certainly something that is, I would say, new in the way that it's spelt out in the revised guidance. VASP will have to undertake due diligence. Actually, it's probably not customer due diligence, but it's due diligence on what FATF calls counterparty VASPs, but probably are not really counterparties at all to a transaction in the way that they're counterparties in a payment transaction, but certainly they are counterpart VASPs. And essentially what FATF is saying is that if you are involved in a transaction where there is a VASP at the other end, involved somehow in the wallet at the other end of a transfer, that could be inbound or outbound. If there's a VASP at the other end, then you also need to have undertaken due diligence on that counterpart VASP. In other words, FATF acknowledging that the relationship between VASPs in those situations is not exactly the same as between correspondent banks in a banking scenario. The type of relationship is very similar, is broadly similar if viewed at from an AML CFT CPT perspective. And so there is a requirement on doing due diligence with your counterpart VASPs. So that means doing due diligence on them. You have to verify the information that you've obtained from on your counterpart VASP. You have to assess that counterpart VASP's AML CFT systems and controls, whether or not, for example, they've had an independent audit taken of their AML processes, and whether or not they're applying the travel rule. And you have to apply effectively a risk-based approach to how you then interact with that counterpart VASP, or indeed whether or not you permit a transfer to go forward based on what you learn in that due diligence process. Where necessary, you have to apply additional controls on VASPs that are based or have a nexus in countries with weak implementation of these FATF standards. And it's not a one-time thing. You have to revisit this periodically. Unfortunately, there's no indication of how often that is. And again, you would probably have to apply a risk-based approach to the frequency of that reassessment. I'll hand, oh no, I'm sorry, I won't hand over to anyone. I'll hand over back to myself. So broadly speaking, and I apologize if I'm moving at pace here, the key areas which are addressed are these interpretive issues around the definitions. We've talked a little about that already. Stable coins being very clearly in scope regardless, and not just stable coins, but very specifically those governance entities or anyone who has any kind of involvement in the governance or rule setting essentially are in scope. Any form of decentralized service is considered largely to be in scope. P2P transactions are addressed, and we'll be talking a little bit more about them later on. And unhosted wallets are very clearly addressed. And there's some guidance for licensing and registration and a lot more information around the travel rule. I'll hand over here to my colleague, Anna James, and she'll take you through the next few points.
Thank you, Siân. As Siân just mentioned, one of the areas clarified in the guidance includes stable coins, or so-called stable coins, as the FATF refers to them. Stable coins have always been within the scope of the FATF recommendations, either as a financial instrument, if, for example, the stable coin was deemed to be a security, in which case the FATF recommendations would apply to the financial instrument as such, or as a virtual asset, if deemed to be a virtual asset, in which case this guidance is relevant to those. Stablecoins are either financial instruments or virtual assets that purport to maintain a stable value by referencing other assets. And they carry similar risks as other virtual assets, given their potential for anonymity and their potential to reach their global reach, and also because they may be used as a method for layering illicit funds. The FATF clarifies in its guidance that they must always be in scope of the recommendations. So this is a very clear message to countries who must now, regardless of what the stablecoin is deemed to be, have a framework in place to apply AML-CFT standards to them. The Financial Action Task Force recognizes that there may be instances where stablecoins are launched in a decentralized manner, so where no central governing body is identifiable. However, it doesn't consider these types of arrangements will have the potential for mass adoption. Rather, the stablecoins it's more worried about are those that are issued or launched by a central identifiable governance body, which can actually reach mass adoption and present financial stability and other risks. Countries and virtual asset service providers or other entities, it could be financial institutions or other, that are dealing with stable coins must, before these are launched, assess the risks of money laundering and terrorist financing presented by them and apply or put in place mitigating actions to address these risks. If we could move on to the next slide, please, Ernest. With regards to licensing and registration, ever since the FATF clarified that its standards apply to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, it required that countries had in place a framework to either license or register a VASP and monitor or supervise a VASP. At a minimum, VASPs that are created in that jurisdiction must be either licensed or registered. And in the case of natural persons, where the business is located, it must also be registered or licensed. Countries are given countries have the option to decide whether they extend the regime to ask that VASPs that operate in their jurisdictions, either conducting business in the jurisdiction or from the jurisdiction, may also need to seek licensing or registration. And the regime that will be implemented by each country will be based on the risks that they have assessed as highest or as priority that need addressing. Countries will need to designate a national competent authority, that is a state designated body such as a central bank or a regulator or a financial intelligence unit or other, that is responsible for the licensing or registration of VASPs and also for the supervision or monitoring of the same. And these bodies will have to have powers to ban the certain activities or certain VAs or restrict them in some ways. Countries may also decide to ban virtual assets and virtual asset service providers altogether in their jurisdictions. However, they still need to actively monitor and be able to identify any VASPs that are carrying out unauthorized activity, and they must be able to impose sanctions or other enforcement actions on these VASPs. My last point here is that the FATF expects that these authorities are national competent authorities rather than self-regulatory bodies who are responsible for licensing and registration and supervision and monitoring. I'll hand back to Siân. Thank you.
Indeed. Anyone who wants to subscribe to get a copy of this presentation, you're very welcome to do so. Ernest will mention it again later on. There is a subscription web address at the very beginning of the chat, and it'll be repeated later on in the presentation, and we'll put it back on the chat again in a moment. So please do keep your questions coming, and we'll do our very best to find the time at the end to answer them. So the travel rule has been is really the name by which by which FATF have implemented the requirements of recommendation 16 as they apply to virtual asset service providers. So this is really a mirror to a large extent of the requirements that apply to banks and financial institutions, popularly known as the funds transfer or wire transfer rule, depending on where you're from. And the travel rule is really about getting required information sent from originating VASPs to beneficiary VASPs, and some responsibilities, if you like, at either end of that transfer of information. There is a de minimis threshold set at $1,000 or euros for the submission of this information. However, it doesn't necessarily apply to all countries, so it's a default, but countries are and already have been implementing this with a nil or lesser threshold. So below which transmitting the information isn't required. Of course, you will appreciate that VASPs in different jurisdictions across different, cross-border type scenarios, may have different de minimis or nil de minimis thresholds, and this mismatch means that information will still need to be sent if the beneficiary VASP, for example, has a lower threshold than the originating VASP. The fundamental requirement is to submit certain verified information about an originator and some information provided by the originator on who the intended beneficiary is, but that doesn't need to be verified by the originating VASP, and to send that information to a VASP at the other end of that transfer. So as you can imagine, there are all sorts of issues like, how do you know that a particular address is hosted or unhosted? And there are technical there are technical solutions being implemented by a variety of providers to try and solve for that problem. I'd probably say at this precise moment in time, there's no single comprehensive answer to this one question, this one point, which kind of kicks it off to a bad start, if you like, because you've got to be able to universally identify for all virtual asset types. Remember, there are now over 10,000 virtual assets, and for every kind, you would have to be able to identify whether the address at the other end is in a hosted or unhosted wallet. So if it's a hosted wallet, there's a VASP at the other end. If it's a VASP, then you've got to send this information if it's over the either party's de minimis threshold, or sorry, over its travel rule threshold. But it isn't just about transmitting the information. There's some due diligence that is absolute in the beginning and end of that process. So in other words, a beneficiary VASP needs to check that the intended beneficiary's name on the information that's just been sent is consistent with its customer's name. And if it isn't, then it needs to satisfy itself whether or not there's some suspicion of something going wrong. We need to justify that, I think. There are all sorts of ideas mentioned in the new guidance about what VASPs might do until the point at which they're satisfied that consistency is okay, that they've carried out their sanction screening, and that they are happy to, in effect, release the funds, release the crypto into the hands or control of its customer. This is, of course, very similar to what banks do, but it kind of suggests measures such as having a holding account or having some control mechanism over the wallet, and so on and so forth. And the technical solutions to these things are not necessarily, well, in most cases, they aren't inherent in crypto. So there are, again, many technical challenges here. There's also a requirement, as I mentioned before, to do due diligence on counterparts. And this itself gives rise to a whole raft of other problems about what's known as the sunrise issue. How do you identify whether there's a VASP? What happens if VASPs in the other jurisdiction aren't yet subject to a licensing regime, because not all countries are bringing this in or have brought it in at the same time. So there's this asynchronous nature in the implementation of regulation, and so on and so forth. A lot of challenges. The new guidance does speak to this, although unfortunately not in very many conclusive terms. It puts the onus on VASPs to be sure that they only take risks where they can afford to take risks, and that raises some interesting questions. There's a clear requirement in this to impose additional controls on VASPs when those VASPs are in countries. So if the counterpart VASP is in a country with weak implementation of the FATF recommendations, or whether maybe the travel rule hasn't yet been implemented or hasn't been implemented yet by that other VASP. And this may require additional controls, including deciding whether or not to go ahead with the transfer. Information that has to be transmitted in any event immediately and securely, but now the guidance says something about submission in batches, but this is still very clear that those batches have to be immediate and concurrent, in effect, with the value transfer, and not sent post transfer. So batches are possible, but not batches in arrears of the transfer having taken place. LEIs, legal entity identifiers, a sort of universal way of identifying every legal entity, every company, and other corporate form, can be provided as optional additional information, but it cannot be used as a substitute for national identifiers where national identifiers are required. There's also something here about transfers with intermediary VASPs. So today, we probably don't see many situations where there's a sort of chain of VASPs between originator and beneficiary. The nature of blockchain doesn't require anything like that. But as there have become restrictions in effect on the VASPs who you do business with as a VASP, which other counterparts you have as VASPs, then I think we may start to see correspondent intermediary style VASP relationships, so payments going via another VASP in order to get to its end destination, because you're going to look for someone who's on a shared network, for example, for travel solution, or someone who has done due diligence on both VASPs, where one or other of the VASP hasn't done business themselves. Really pushing this industry very much to copy what is done in the banking sector. Fundamentally, one's required to obtain information, screen that information, and then transmit it, monitor it as well. There are also implications for VASPs on unhosted wallets. So there are a number of places where it says that unhosted wallets may pose a higher risk, but when you see something like that written enough times, you probably reckon that is the more or less the presumption. Certainly there are risks which may not be present in the hosted wallet sector, if you like. And so for VASPs, they need to think about taking appropriate risk-based measures in relation to value that they receive in from clients, for where those clients are sending them not from another VASP, but from their own self-hosted wallet. They may subject unhosted wallet customers to enhanced monitoring. They may impose extra customer or transaction due diligence where there's a history of unhosted wallets. So in other words, you may be receiving value from a client's other hosted wallet, but where transactions with that hosted wallet previously have had unhosted wallet transactions, you need to take that into account and have done appropriate due diligence. So of course, one can see there's a lot of scope for the blockchain analytics companies to provide that kind of information. Unhosted wallet transactions, VASPs are encouraged indeed to limit or prohibit transactions with unhosted wallets if that's the only way that they can manage, that's the only way they can manage risk. This kind of requirement may certainly affect the ability to interact with counterpart VASPs if one has a lot of interaction oneself with unhosted wallets. So how you manage folks who send value to you, or to whom you send value where there's an unhosted wallet, may be a factor in how another VASP decides to do business with you. And for countries, they're urged to consider risk mitigation measures such as prohibiting or restricting the use of unhosted wallets where that is the only way they feel they can manage the risks, or to prohibit or restrict, limit in some way their licensed and registered VASPs interaction with unhosted wallets. I'll pass you over now to my colleague Nathan Catania to take us through DeFi and decentralized services.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, so I guess if you've been involved in the crypto industry, if you've been actively involved in this industry, you'd be aware that decentralized finance has seen significant growth over the past years. What we've seen with these decentralized finance applications is that they've been largely unregulated. So to date, there's very little or if any, or no regulation on these DeFi projects. The FATF, even in its original guidance, they did look at dApps, and some wording, some terminology on dApps was included in the original guidance. Even in this updated guidance, they're very clear that dApps themselves, so a decentralized application, is not a VASP. The FATF is not looking to regulate technology itself. But one thing that they've made very clear with this new guidance is that entities that are involved in dApps and decentralized finance are very likely to be considered to be VASPs. Okay, with dApps, if you think about decentralized finance, the key differentiator of this type of activity is that these transactions, they're settled in a peer-to-peer manner. They rely on smart contracts to effect transfers of value. The creator doesn't usually have custody or influence on these assets themselves. But with this new guidance, the FATF have really clarified and they're really pushing for wide interpretation on what a VASP is. And by doing so, they do appear to be capturing many of these DeFi activities that are currently unregulated would seem to fall in this expansive definition of what a VASP is. So they have actually included a lot of new information on DeFi and decentralized services in this updated guidance. They haven't specifically included new requirements per se, but they have included many statements and comments on mainly on the scope and how these activities are likely to fall within the scope of a VASP definition. So they do clarify that recommendations, they will apply to owners, creators, anyone that undertakes a VASP-related activity, irrespective of whether it's being built on a smart contract or decentralized protocol, should be considered a VASP. So effectively, they're pushing countries to really widen this definition and capture these types of activities. They even go so far as saying that multi-sig participants could be considered a VASP if the multi-sig arrangement is performing a VASP service. There's a comment in the guidance which covers the activity of a lawyer, for example, acting as an escrow between a VA transfer, if they are performing that as a service, and if that service meets the definition of a VASP activity, then even that service could be considered a VASP-related activity. So I guess the key is really that if any element of a VASP definition is in place, then the likelihood is that you're a VASP. And as Siân mentioned earlier, one of the key factors here is that if as a business, you're performing VASP services, then you are a VASP. And that's one of the key factors to consider is whether you're collecting fees from providing this activity. And for me, what really stands out is that they're mentioning that if you're collecting fees directly or indirectly, that is a factor, a very large contributing factor to whether you're a VASP. So as Siân mentioned, a DeFi project which has an associated token that puts this token out there, they stand to gain significantly from any value increases of these tokens, of price appreciation of a token, and they're holding back a large reserve of tokens, then that could be considered to be some kind of VASP activity as well. Okay, so as I said, no real new requirements here, but it really allows you to appreciate where they're coming from and really get into the minds of these standard setters. And I've just included a few quotes here from the guidance, just to really emphasize how wide-reaching they feel the remit is and how easy it is to fall within this VASP definition. So just to go over a few of them, they do mention that decentralization of any individual element of operation does not eliminate VASP coverage if any parts of the definition are in place. In launching a self-propelling infrastructure to offer VASP services is the same as offering them, which is quite a strong statement. Launching a business that offers a qualifying function such as transfer of assets may qualify an entity for a VASP, even if they give up control after launching it. So you could probably draw analogies to some type of DeFi projects in the past that have deployed and developed a decentralized application and then relinquished ownership of keys. Even that would not be enough to move you away from this VASP definition. And another very interesting statement is that they believe that there's very few VA arrangements, looking at the entire industry and based on all of their research, that at one point does not involve a VASP. So at some point of the issuance or creation or any VA relationship, there will be a VASP associated to that particular VA. And lastly, that automating a system does not relieve controlling parties of obligations. So again, very little by way of new requirements, but it really shows how broad the FATF intend their VASP definition to be and how broadly countries are to interpret VASP activities, and therefore potentially bringing what a lot of the current DeFi activity is within their scope. That's not saying that there won't be DeFi related activities and there won't be purely decentralized applications, but it will be very, very difficult to escape being a VASP currently. Okay, so finally, peer-to-peer transactions, unhosted wallets. Sian's already covered this earlier. But again, here you can really get into the mind of the standard setters, where they're saying that peer-to-peer transactions may pose higher risks. They should potentially be considered as higher risk, and the more you hear that being mentioned and the more you see that in the standards, the more you get a feeling that the may or should is probably should be a bit stronger than the language in the guidance. One of the threats that the FATF do consider is that if peer-to-peer transactions, if unhosted wallet activities do gain traction, we could end up with a large part of our financial system outside scope of the existing FATF recommendation. So that's something that could be a longer term threat, because if you do have a large amount of peer-to-peer activity, then it's not involving VASPs, so it will be outside the remit. Remember, these VASPs, they act as gatekeepers. They're the ones that really police the FATF standards and requirements. So the absence of a VASP means that there's a lot more unregulated activity outside the FATF remit. Another key point is that VASPs are asked to consider mitigating risks even before launching new products. Okay, so it's not enough to launch a product that is incapable of complying with the FATF standards. Prior to doing so, you need to consider the risks. So again, that could also be a warning sign to VASPs that are developing DeFi type products that potentially are incapable of complying with the FATF standards and recommendations.
Sian, over to you.
Yes, I'm to unmute myself. Sorry, we all do that once, don't we? In the interest of time, I'm going to whiz through this, and these are really my insights, my personal perspective on what I think it's going to, what the implications of the guidance are. I mean, the guidance is detailed. We've just scratched the surface, and as Ernest mentioned at the beginning, this is just the first of a whole series of webinars and explainers that we'll be publishing and holding. That will go into specific areas ever deeper, if you like, into the new guidance between now and even after adoption at the June FATF plenary. But here's my view on what's likely to happen. I believe that crypto will bifurcate. It will split. The industrialized, intermediated, compliant crypto, the regulated space is going to go in one direction. It's going to comply with the national implementations of this, and no doubt future guidance that will yet further draw in as much as possible and make clear that it's attempting to draw, although I don't think it needs to say it any louder. You can read into that DeFi as it is today, in fact, anyone who's asked a question about decentralized products and activities, if you like, in the chat, anyone who's asked those questions probably has an interest in wanting them to be outside scope, but the fact that you're asking the question means you're almost certainly in scope somehow. And so folks who basically want to make some money out of crypto, out of the business of crypto, hence my term in the industrialized sector of crypto, will go in one direction. But I also think that those who are concerned with privacy, there are a lot of folks out there who don't want to share their information with Google. They'll use DuckDuck or other browsers that don't want to use Facebook's Messenger, but would rather use Signal. There are a whole host of people that are not necessarily doing bad things, but for whom privacy stands as a fundamental in their lives. They will move in the opposite direction, or in a different forked direction, together with, of course, the money launderers. There's no way of separating them, and this will move into an ever more anonymous crypto, really the digital equivalent of cash, which of course was what Satoshi Nakamoto considered Bitcoin was for when he created, they created, really started this whole virtual asset piece. So regulated crypto will have to get used to a lot of compliance costs. It's expensive to comply in every respect. And that's going to mean that the costs are going to match those of more traditional instruments and more traditional means of payment. The upside is, for some anyway, that there'll be more institutional engagement, the more it looks like stuff that their compliance people are comfortable with. But also beware, if you're, if you're in some form of new style intermediary function in crypto, the banks and financial institutions will soon be entering the fray. And remember, they have deep pockets and they know how to do all this stuff. Those who have aspirations for crypto in terms of solving some aspects of financial exclusion, well, I'm afraid the regulated piece of crypto solves nothing. One's going to have to look elsewhere for solutions for the 2 billion that are financially excluded. And unregulated crypto, well, I think we will see more and better from the perspective of those for whom it's important. We'll see more and better anonymity enhanced cryptocurrencies, privacy coins. There'll be more and cleverer Moneros out there, and we'll see more anonymous development. We 12 years on, we still don't know whether Satoshi Nakamoto was a he, she, or they, and we're already starting to see new DeFi projects which have been deployed entirely anonymously. So there's no one at the beginning and no one in the middle. And this is going to become an area of ever more decentralization. So from your perspectives, the next steps, well, if you are in any way involved in crypto, you really do need to carefully consider your regulatory status. And that's not just in the place that your feet are placed, but if you're a company, where that company's created, where you are, where you're located, where you operate from, and there's even specific mention of where people are based. So you may be registered in one place, have your offices in another place, and yet have a nexus of people or management based in a particular place, or have a call center in a particular place, or a sales function in a particular place. And also the places into which you provide services. So those jurisdictions that you are effectively where you have customers, you'll have to consider whether or not they're imposing regulatory requirements. Whatever it is, it's either a financial instrument or a financial asset or a virtual asset. There is no third way. There's no other ground that's conceived, and FATF makes this abundantly clear in a number of places in the new guidance. So if you develop or launch or deploy or issue or intermediate crypto in some way, or if you commission others to do so, or if you earn or derive any kind of benefit either now or at some point in the future from those activities, then you're probably a VASP, and you're a VASP now. You need to review your policies, your procedures, your systems and controls to make sure that they are compliant. You need to hire experienced crypto-aware compliance people, and they are not easily found right now. There's a shortage of compliance people generally in the traditional financial world, and certainly fewer that have the experience and are crypto-aware. You need to decide who you want to do business with. Whether holders of unhosted wallets are something that you can include amongst your customers, or what criteria you want to place on such. And you need to also consider and decide what counterpart VASPs you're prepared to work with and how you approach that. And you need to get ready for a hell of a lot of due diligence work. And of course, well, I'm bound to say this as our closing remark, but you're free to speak to us, and we're certainly here to help in any of the above, or indeed if you want help in submitting a response to the consultation.
Thank you, Siân. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I think we've tried to fit in a lot of information in an hour. It's been really difficult to get through everything. We've had quite a few questions. I know, Siân, you've tried to answer a few questions in the chat. Just a quick reminder, if you want to make sure that you get notified for future webinars or the releases of our explainers, please subscribe to on the link displayed on the slide. As I said before, we'll be closing the meeting officially, but we'll keep it open for those that may want to stay behind. I know that some people have been dropping off. We've overrun by a couple of minutes. But as I said, we're staying on. We'll go through some of the questions on the chat, and we can open up the floor for any other questions. As Siân said, if anyone needs any help with anything, either be it responding to the consultation or otherwise understanding requirements and what you may need to do to get ready for this new guidance, please reach out to us. There's an email address there on the website, Anna's email. Please feel free to send an email to her. That's it. Thank you.
So happy to thank you those who have to move on to something else, and happy to maybe Ernest, if you want to moderate some of these questions and decide how we deal with it.
Yeah, I will. I was looking at it, and I know that you've answered some questions, but there's one from Obi, one of the first questions. I don't think that one's been answered. So he's asking, are layer 2 node operators such as Lightning, stakers, or liquidity providers, farmers in scope? Who wants to take that question?
What I would probably say here is that if the only activity and the only reward that you get is from the activity of mining, rather and validation, if you're performing only those functions and no other functions, so you're not participating in any way in the underlying transfer of value, an involvement in the transfer of value beyond validating transactions, then you're probably out of scope. But I would also say that there are numbers of activities where it is not that clear, and so it does require a detailed analysis really of what has taken you into scope or what allows you to be out of scope. And that's why I say on that penultimate slide, really, you need to review your regulatory status. It is undoubtedly complicated, but the presumption, as I pointed out at the beginning, is that you're included rather than you're excluded. So you've got to, you start from saying, I think I'm included. Is that true? And can I put that to the test to see if it is justified that I fall into one of these exemptions in a way that is abundantly clear? If not, I'm in scope.
I think Obi, you unmuted yourself. Did you want to say anything?
No, well, thank you for the talk, by the way. Great as usual. Is it fair to say that the analysis for Lightning nodes and liquidity providers has not, for some certain DeFi projects, so has not yet been done?
Can you say that again, Obi? I missed a little bit of it. Sorry, go again.
Is it fair to say that the analysis for Lightning node operators and liquidity providers, etc., has not yet been done?
No, I think, I mean, for all of us in this space, you know, we all read it on Friday last week, and it's long and comprehensive, and we now have work going on in our team to look at different scenarios and to see if we can help folks understand better exactly those kind of questions. But we have not concluded any detailed analysis of specific out of scope scenarios.
All right, thank you very much, and great talk as usual, by the way.
Thank you, Obi. Nice to have you on the call.
Okay, thank you. We have a question which I don't think was answered from William Grob, and he's addressed it to you, Siân. Siân, from your perspective and in the candid feedback to FATF, Will the risk-based approach be a standard that will require a comprehensive risk assessment and a process that many VASPs will find challenging to complete given the changing regulatory and business environment? And then it goes on to add, the FATF approach pretty much treats VASPs as financial institutions. You want to add anything else?
I think I couldn't put it better myself. You've made all the points.
Yeah.
Yes, you're going to have to risk assess your business from an AML CFT perspective, so far as this piece is concerned, but of course in some places also from a conduct and prudential perspective too, because some jurisdictions have brought the different facets together in one regulatory regime. Yeah, there's risk assessment to do. There's a risk-based approach to the whole of one's business and one's activities and the assets that one's transacting with and the types of clients that one's dealing with. The risk assessments, managing risk is fundamental to the way that AML CFT is done, and absolutely that's the expectation, and hence my comment towards the end that compliance costs, and it is not something that a lot of folks in the virtual asset world are, have inherently got the resources in-house yet to do, but they will have to do so as they're required to do, and they will be required to do it in order to get licensed or registered.
Thank you, Siân.
And the other point, FATF wants this sector to be like financial institutions, and I don't know if that in and of itself that's the goal, but they want the technology to be considered neutrally. They want the same outcomes to apply, and consequently, FATF members want the same rules effectively to apply. In fact, it says as much in the new guidance. The only exceptions in terms of a nuanced application are recommendations 10 and 16, most notably, some aspects of CDD and some aspects of the travel rule have nuances, but outside of that, essentially they're reinforcing the notion that the whole of the recommendations as they apply to VASPs are to be treated in exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Siân. We've got a travel rule related question from Lyle Jones. In the absence of the message standard not being finalized, are VASPs still required to exchange travel rule data? I think that's a question that many people are considering.
Can you, I'm sorry, for some reason, I'm
sorry.
Very clearly. Could you say that again?
I'll repeat it again. Yes. So in the absence of the message standard not being finalized, are VASPs still required to exchange the travel rule data?
It's a very good question. It's a really good question, and it's sort of the notion around the sunrise problem and beyond. So the first thing is, do the standards apply? Do the standards exist for the data that needs to be transferred? And the answer to that is yes. Indeed, I and one of my colleagues, Neil Samtani at XReg, were directly involved in work a year ago. We worked on something known as IVMS 101, which is a data model standard, and I had the privilege to be the convener and one of the co-leads of the group, a cross-industry, cross-sectoral, collaborative standard setting effort to define a standard for the data model. In other words, how should a name look? How should it be expressed? Is a date, day, month, year, or month, day, year? How do you deal with names that originate in, say, Chinese or in Japanese or Korean or another script or another language? How should they be transliterated and transposed? A whole range of those kind of technical issues. And we started, I think, with about 30 technical experts and ended with 140 at the time the standard was finished and published. That was at the beginning of May last year already. Anyone who wants to get it can go to intervasp.org. It's free to download the standard, and so that standard is there. You'll see that up on the. Oops, sorry, I should have sent that to everybody, and I sent it to. I'll put it back up to someone. Anna, perhaps you could just pop that intervasp.org up on the chat for me to everyone. And so the standard for it exists. The technical solutions for getting that required data from one VASP to another isn't yet fully there. There are a number of travel rule solution providers, probably about a dozen or more, who are at various stages of development and implementation of their solutions. Some are open standards like Open VASP and TRISA. Others are closed user groups such as the US Travel Rule Working Group. Others are offering proprietary solutions such as Netkey and Signabridge and Nota Bene and others. Some are meant for in-house implementation and some as external solutions. There are various ones. Obviously, a big question when you've got a lot of solutions out there is interoperability between them, because it's no good if you're on one network and somebody else that you're trying to communicate with is on another. So there's a whole set of stuff around that. But those solutions are becoming available, and you know, I think folks should take advantage of looking at those solutions and showing that they satisfying themselves that they can implement them, and secondly that they can they are ready and can demonstrate to their regulators that they are ready to implement their chosen solutions the moment they are viable. Let's put it that way. But you know, countries are expecting their providers their VASPs to implement, and it's merely a case of regulatory forbearance, that they're not actually penalizing anybody for not doing it, because they do recognize, I think I have yet to find a regulator who doesn't recognize that as yet it's not technically possible. But there's a lot of saber rattling going on, and I expect to see quite a lot about this in the second 12-month review report from FATF that comes out in the summer.
Great, thank you, Sean. Nathan, maybe one for you, this one, from Gavin Smith. He's asking, if you hold tokens related to a DeFi project, but are in no way involved in its development and don't derive a fee from holding the token, are you a VASP? This would basically make everyone a VASP merely for speculating on a token.
A good question. I would say that in the majority of cases, simply holding a token will not make you a VASP. As you mentioned, this would mean that anyone speculating on the price of a crypto asset is likely to be a VASP. And I think that's far from the intention, I guess, from the FATF. I mean, the scope has been expanded significantly to capture largely unregulated DeFi activities, but they are looking to capture these parties or groups of people that have this influence over these applications. If you've developed a dApp that is powered by a token and that is then launched, and you retain a significant chunk of those tokens, you'd probably be considered a VASP. A lot of the new DeFi applications have some sort of governance arrangements. So by holding a token, you may be able to participate in governance. So I would say potentially if you become a particular DeFi whale and hold a large percentage of a certain DeFi token to the extent that you can influence the application, that might actually make you a VASP. But holding a relatively low percentage of these tokens and not participating in the governance process, for example, I think you'd be quite comfortably outside of scope in this case.
And if I may just add to what Nathan has said, there is a little guidance in there's a little in the guidance on if you like, what factors ought to be taken into account. So I think if you're just you're investing in tokens for yourself, then you're probably not a VASP. But this gets complicated, as Nathan was alluding to, when you look at governance tokens, and you can kind of say, well, where's the parallel in the traditional world? Well, if you're an individual shareholder in a company, then you're probably you don't have the kind of responsibilities of being a director, for example, and you probably aren't someone who might be held accountable for AML/CFT deficiencies, shall we say, failings. But if you had a large holding, then you might be considered to be, and this is, I think, where Nathan was coming to, just as you would be if you performed some management roles. So, for example, if you're part of the decision-making process as to on how certain things work within that network or within that, what they like to now call a virtual asset arrangement, that's a term that's used a few times to try and be all-encompassing, then you may be. And so these are, I'm just citing from some of them, these are some of the factors that FATF says should be taken into account. Those who profit from the use of the service or the virtual asset, those who establish or can change the rules, those who can make decisions affecting operations, those who generate and drive the creation and launch of the product or service, those who possess and control the data on its operations. So that's on its operations. That's distinct, if you like, from necessarily the ownership noted in a blockchain. Those who can shut down the product or service. So if you're a single lone voice holding a small quantity of governance tokens, you're probably not going to be in scope, I would say, would seem to be the indication. But if you're you have a heavy involvement in shaping it, if you have an involvement in Nathan used a great term. If you're a whale in a particular token, you're almost certainly going to be, if you have a sort of fairly significant holding, then that may well bring you into scope. And unfortunately, this is not a perimeter-based set of requirements. So it doesn't say, if you meet this precise thing, then you are, and if you don't, you aren't. It's saying the presumption is everybody is in unless there's a good reason why you're not, and then you have to interpret what is said in there about people who are outside scope in order to try and come to a conclusion. But it could bring a lot of people who don't think or wouldn't have thought they were in scope, is now brought them in scope.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah. And remember the changes to these standards, or I guess the guidance. This is being pushed on countries to implement in their legislation. So we still need to see how countries approach this and what sort of test, I guess, is applied to whether you're a VASP or not. So this is something that it's worth also observing, how countries start implementing this in their legal frameworks.
Which takes us quite nicely to one other question from Gavin, which he's asking, in your opinion, what is a realistic time frame until the FCA has adopted these recommendations and starts to enforce them? Which obviously we know the answer is we don't know for sure how they're gonna interpret it, how much they're gonna change their legislation to try and accommodate this. Sean, Nathan,
I was going to say another key point really is that, remember, the FCA aren't the ones that drive or change legislation. This is down to the UK government to implement the legislation and then potentially assign the FCA to police it, which the likelihood is they will, because the FCA are already responsible for crypto asset registration. So it really is more of a policy level decision that the UK government needs to take prior to assigning it to the FCA.
That's right. I think we've got a few other questions which may be similar to others that have been asked, and I think we've already answered them. I'll just try another one here we've got from Boon Yon Chan around mining pools. And the question is, mining pools like those for Bitcoin take fees, rewards, and just wanted to reconfirm that this actually gives them a VASP characteristics and means that they could or should be licensed.
Well, it's an area that we're certainly looking at as part of our sort of more detailed drill down analysis of how this new guidance might affect specific activities. But my sense, so this is just my initial thoughts, stressing that this stuff literally came out last Friday. My sense is that being a participant in a mining pool probably isn't. But that someone who organizes a mining pool, operates a mining pool, puts it out there, maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The emphasis here is on those who intermediate the financial services, and this is how this stuff is brought in, right? You've got to look at it from, is there some sort of service being provided in the middle? There is a tension, interestingly enough, sort of slightly digressing. You know, in pretty much most FATF definitions of who's in scope, it's about, especially in financial institutions or in VASPs, it's about those who do certain activities, perform certain activities on behalf of others or on behalf of customers. And, you know, taken literally, you might say, and legalistically, which, remember, this isn't directly law, you might say that on behalf of implies one's an agent, that there's somebody else who's the principal. However, when you drill down into a lot of FATF stuff, not just around VA activity, you will see that it actually extends to a broader range of functions, and those include issuers. And I think one of the things that's come out quite clearly in this new guidance is anyone who issues a token, even though they're doing it for themselves or doing it together with others, but they're in effect the principal, they're actually within scope. So one would have to look at the on behalf of a customer pretty broadly. And it's something we're certainly going to take up with FATF in the consultation, this very point, because it's quite fuzzy when on one hand you talk about you're a VASP, but only if you're doing something on behalf of somebody else, and then find in the detail that they're saying that even if you're doing it for yourself. So some interesting stuff there. Watch this space, I would say.
Cool. I think, oh, we've got a response from Boon-Hyun Chan. Thank you, Lords. If mining, staking pools are in scope on first reaction, crypto's transaction broadcast mechanism can make compliance and adherence complex. Yes, I think that's been made clear throughout the presentation. There's definitely going to be some challenges and difficulties, hurdles to overcome to ensure compliance with the FATF recommendations and guidance.
There's a very interesting question from Mohammed Atik, saying that in Bahrain, they're trying to enforce the travel rule on a particular company. But how is that possible to comply right now? And this is really both the technical problem being solved in its entirety, from end to end in totality, and the sunrise problem. If nobody else in the world is, other VASPs aren't yet required to fall into to comply with the travel rule, how do you actually achieve it? And it's a very good question. I mean, literally, some groups, as the Travel Rule Protocol group, have in mind that you know, you'd have to have some sort of email, having identified that there's a VASP at the other end, which means asking presumably some very specific questions of your customer to find out, you know, and that for them to find out whether the wallet at the other end is a hosted or unhosted wallet, and if it's hosted, who's the VASP at the other end. But maybe using email, which seems incredibly insecure and non-private and complex, but that's one way. Bulletin boards are proposed in a couple of the solutions out there being developed, so that every VASP posts onto the bulletin board all their hosted wallet addresses. But it's really hard for one country to push for implementation when so few other countries. And I'm afraid this was a foreseen problem, this sunrise problem, and there is no guidance from FATF beyond saying, if the other side of the transaction hasn't implemented it yet, either it doesn't have a registration regime, for example, or it doesn't yet implement the travel rule, then you need to assess the money laundering risks associated in that circumstance, and if necessary, deny a transfer. That's what it says.
Great, thank you. I think we've gone through the majority of the questions. I think we're going to leave it there. We still have quite a few participants, so thanks for hanging in there. All the information that you need is on the slide. If you want to reach out to us, if you have any other questions, please feel free to send us an email if you need any help with anything, or if you want to subscribe to any of our future explainers and webinars, please subscribe on the link there on the slide. Thank you everyone again for attending. We hope you found it useful and hope to see you again next time.